Well, let's keep in mind that he's now on his way to being commander-in-chief. And while the donors exert enormous influence, as you rightly point out, he is now commander-in-chief, and he has to make decisions that he thinks are in the interests of the American people first and foremost. Whether or not he picks from the slate that you just mentioned or decides on another course of action is unknown. You and many others, Judge, I think Ron Paul was someone else, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, many people have said to him repeatedly over the years, personnel is policy. I think he understands that. I think he knows it. So we can't be 100% certain of whatever the rumors are right now. We have to, frankly, we do have to be patient, wait and see, because I can tell you from my interaction with him that in his heart of hearts, this is someone who is absolutely opposed to war. This is someone who doesn't want any wars, doesn't want conflict. And if he's got the flexibility and maneuver room to avoid it, he will do so. And I think he does. I think it's actually very good that we are at a kind of standstill in the Middle East right now. And I think given what's happening in Ukraine, that can be closed out quicker and sooner than obviously the Middle East. But I think that's his inclination. And he's beset with so many challenges. The last thing he needs is conflict overseas. It's not going to help him here at home. It's not going to help him achieve what he wants to here in the United States. And as we've always said, and I think he believes this as well, the most important things happen right here inside the United States, not beyond our borders. I think that's a good point. We've seen in the past, though, that regardless of whomever is there, he continues to think for himself and does what he wants in spite of all the advice he gets. Now, the good news, I think, if there is any, is that the people in the Defense Department at lower levels in the armed forces, especially the Army and the Air Force, and I think to a lesser extent the Navy, are all acutely sensitive to the prospects of a major, major war in the region. And we're not prepared for it. And he knows we're not prepared for it. I'm sure he's been told that. Not necessarily by the Harris administration, but by others who are in a position to know. So it would be very, very foolish for him to pursue a course of action that guarantees future conflict. Now, beyond that, I don't know what he's going to do. Expanding the borders of Israel sounds great. And then you got to look at the map and figure out how you are going to reach some sort of amicable agreement with hundreds of millions of people, although you don't know the extent to which he feels he can trap the future president as well as the current administration in a war that they would otherwise not want to fight. This was always my concern, that things would get off the ground before the election, presenting whomever was voted into office with a fait accompli. So, you know, that's no longer on the table. Right. But here, consider this for a second. There are a lot of people with greater expertise than I have in the Middle East, and many of them have told me that the Iranians have also waited for the outcome of this election. And given his very forceful rhetoric, very belligerent rhetoric towards Iran, the thinking in Tehran is that they might as well let loose and do as much damage as they can to Israel, regardless, because there's no point in exercising any more restraint because there's no evidence that Mr. Trump is prepared to exercise that restraint. So that's a good example of what the impact of the election is, at least in the minds of the Iranians. Now, on the Israeli side, it may be the opposite. They may feel that they're now entitled to use whatever they have to destroy the nuclear facilities and potentially go after the oil production system. Who knows? Again, this is all speculative, and I wish I knew more, just as you do, but I think we have to reckon with those. Golda Meir was ultimately held responsible for the disaster in 1973, ostensibly because she decided to disregard warnings about an imminent Egyptian attack across the canal. Now, in those days, it was a little different. The Egyptians had practiced assaulting the canal so many times that the Israelis became convinced that they were watching something similar to what we used to see in East Germany when I was stationed there, with the Soviets would also practice these moves that looked like imminent attacks toward the west, and then just before they reached the border, they would halt, turn around, and then go back to their barracks and prepare to repeat the same sort of thing in the future. That was a terrible mistake. There was also a view that there was incompetence in 1973 in terms of the way things were set up and the very weak manning of the line in Suez. So the Israelis know what they're doing when this sort of thing comes. And I do think that it will become very, very clear that 7 October was allowed to happen, that it shouldn't have happened. And I think that will come out. And that, of course, will be the end of Mr. Netanyahu forever. The question is, will the Israeli state itself survive all of this in the long run? And I still think that's very much up to, it's simply unknown. It does. Something most Americans don't understand is that, contrary to many of their assumptions and beliefs, Israel at its founding was by no means a religious state. The Israeli state was founded by Jews in the ethnic, cultural, racial sense of the word. Most of them were absolutely not religious. And in fact, in the discussion, someone raised the question of whether or not they might consider barring the immigration of the Jewish sects that you're referring to into Israel. And the consensus was, we don't need to do that because life here is tough. It's hard. It's dangerous. They'll never come here. Well, of course, they were wrong. And now they are a substantial portion of the population that wields real power. So I think that's a sore point for most of the Israelis that serve in the armed forces and have served in the past. Secondly, I think Gallant is also signaling that he was not responsible for what happened on 7 October and is quite anxious to see the person who is held accountable. I suspect that will be Netanyahu. But Gallant also knows that when you take a job like this as a defense minister in the middle of a war, you're inevitably going to end up at some point somebody's scapegoat or sacrificial lamb. So I think he was also making that clear. And finally, he's talking about the lessons that have to be learned that weren't learned. Well, let's be frank. Things have not gone well in Gaza. They haven't gone well in southern Lebanon. And the Israelis have done everything they can to conceal that particular truth. Now, how high were the casualties? I don't know. But you don't have to go very high in Israel before it has a profound impact on the population. And I think that's another irritant for him. I think he was also someone else that said, look, we have to practice economy of enemies. And you'll remember a few weeks ago, we watched a cabinet meeting where Netanyahu said, we're fighting on 5 fronts. And then subsequently it was on 7. And we're going to settle accounts effectively with everyone. We're going to go and we're going to destroy everyone. I think Gallant was one of those people that said, that's not possible. We have to rein in or suppress these expectations. We have to look at our resources, our capabilities. We have to focus like a laser on what we need to do quickly and win, as opposed to what you're planning, which is effectively a limitless war. Of course, all of that is predicated on unconditional support from us for whatever they do. And I don't think Gallant was someone who believed that that was going to work over the long. Let's put it this way, and I haven't seen the photos, but I've been briefed on the sidelines. The Israelis succeeded in doing more damage than people thought at the time. The Iranians obviously weren't interested in advertising that, but they struck some vulnerabilities, especially the missile production system. And I think that's had an impact in Iran. On the other hand, their air and missile defenses worked brilliantly, in the sense that it became very clear that they could not essentially break through the air and missile defenses and eat with ease and bomb at will, which was the plan. In other words, we go in, we defang the Iranians, and then we can fly with impunity anywhere we want. That was not possible. So I think the Iranians are acutely sensitive to what happened, and they're working very, very hard right now to compensate for those vulnerabilities, if not eliminate them. And that's why, the Russians are shipping in Su-35s. The Iranian pilots are working closely with the Russian pilots to learn how to fly them properly. I still would not rule out the possibility that Russian pilots end up flying. So that's an exaggeration. But he's half right. And he's saying exactly what I told you, that This was more destructive and more effective than was originally reported. And most important, the missile production capability was damaged. The S-300 is a much older system, and it's not the only system that's there. They have the S-400 as well. And again, I think much of that has been repaired. And we'll see in future operations to what extent the Iranians have, as I said, compensated and repaired the problem. The Israelis are doing the same kinds of things. And they experienced something very similar when the hypersonic missiles found their targets and demonstrated that the Israelis could do nothing to stop it. So, I think you have to say on both sides right now, there's a realization of their respective vulnerabilities. The problem that I have with Israel's determination to start this war with Iran is that there are almost 100 million people in Iran, in a nation that's the size of Western Europe. Compare that with Israel. And Israel cannot sustain the kind of damage it wants to inflict on Iran, which could ultimately end up being inflicted on them. That's the point. Well, I think he's achieved his geographic goals with the exception of having secured Odessa. I mean, Kharkov is in ruins. It's his for the taking. But he originally looked at the areas that were historically Russian, where the Russian population lived. Remember, Odessa was the site where Russians were herded into burning buildings and murdered. And this had an enormous impact in Moscow, as you can well imagine. This was one of the rationales for subsequent Russian intervention, which is to protect the Russian population inside eastern Ukraine. I think he's largely accomplished that goal, with the exception that I pointed out. Right now, the conditions on the battlefield in Ukraine are truly horrific. They're losing thousands and thousands of people needlessly and pointlessly. This is not an army as you would think of it anymore. These are formations and units streaming west, trying to escape the destruction that is following them. The Russians are moving very deliberately and very carefully. They're not interested in taking any unnecessary casualties. And as we talked the last time, they've made good use of these glide bombs because the Ukrainians have no air defense at all. That means that the aircraft can fly up in relatively close proximity to the target, launch the glide bombs, and they launched as many as 1,100 of these in a week. And the damage it's something from which the ground force cannot recover. So I think it's over in Ukraine. I think everybody in Europe knows it. When I say everybody, I'm talking about the elites that have been on the wrong side of this question from the beginning. The Ukrainians are dying. We gave them some life support, sending $400 or $500 million over to Ukraine right now. That satisfies the appetite for cash with the various people that are running things and the government and the bureaucracy and the leadership of the military. But it's like giving a heart patient that's on his last legs a haircut and a shave. It's not going to change a damn thing. And at least we haven't seen any more stupid long-range strikes into Russia, which only guarantees more Ukrainian losses. So I think everybody knows it has to stop. The question is, will we do what we have to do? And what we have to do is simply say, that's it. We're suspending all military aid. And we're getting all of our citizens in uniform and out of uniform out of Ukraine. That's what has to happen. If that happens, the whole picture changes. And this war can come to a very rapid close. I wouldn't have expected him to say anything else. He's been lying through his teeth for months and months and months about everything. And it's impossible for him to do anything other than put a smiley face on the dead rat, which is essentially his regime.
Right.
He's going to keep it up as long as he can. When the cash runs out, so will he and all of his friends. That's coming. It's inevitable. We saw it in Afghanistan. We saw the same sort of thing everywhere we've ever been. When the regime that we propped up fell apart, that was the end. And that's where we're headed in Ukraine. The regime in Kiev has to go away. The Russians aren't going to waste any time negotiating with them. And regardless of what President Trump says, Putin is the sort of person who's going to want to see action. And the actions that I just described, stop all the aid, end it, and pull out everybody who's an American citizen in or out of uniform, CIA, military, whatever it is. If he sees that happen, then all sorts of things are possible, and it will make sense for him and his government to talk to President Trump. But to be frank with you right now, There's no reason why the Russians should believe anything we say about anything. Well, that's where we are. The other thing is that if we want to get to some sort of closure in the Middle East, we've got to have a satisfactory closure in Ukraine first. Otherwise, our position in the Middle East is equally untenable, as we're going to discover once the missiles begin to fly again. One judge. But the bottom line is, no, you're correct. And that's why this whole business of, as you've said, and Rand Paul, and others, personnel is policy. We'll have to wait and see who is announced as occupying what position. And of course, if the president says it doesn't matter because I make all of the decisions, then we're in a lot of trouble, because that means that he hasn't learned from the first term, the first 4 years. He's presiding over the largest corporate structure in the world. And this thing is extremely unresponsive, as you and I know. So he's got to do two things simultaneously. He's got to deal with what we've been discussing, and that corporate monster, the Leviathan, has to be cut down to size. And he's got executive order power. He's got a number of authorities as president that allow him to do many, many things with the executive branch. He's going to have to act very decisively. I hope he has a stack of executive orders ready to go, because that's what happened to us with Biden. You can say what you will about the Biden administration, but they came in with executive orders designed to utterly destroy their opposition, which is us, and to permanently alter the character and composition of the American people. They came in ready to fire, a broadside, and they did. That's what President Trump needs to do now.
Well, obviously, I think Tulsi Gabbard would make a much better Secretary of State because she represents the more balanced and nuanced approach to foreign policy and recognizes the criticality of avoiding war. I think Tulsi Gabbard and others that support Donald Trump, like me, have to come to the conclusion that what Trump thinks is either unclear or it's clear. And he has hitched his wagon 100% to the Zionist cause in the Middle East, which means war to expand the state of Israel and destroy everyone that Israel doesn't like or Israel fears. That includes, first and foremost, Iran. I think he and his team are committed to that objective. That's where we're headed. If anybody has any questions about it, start paying attention to what people actually say. At some point, you have to listen to people and believe them. And President Trump has made very clear statements about Iran and where he expects to go. And if anything, he's being critical for the most part of the Biden administration for not doing enough against Iran. And I think Waltz and Hegseth are of the same mindset. So is Rubio. I think anybody who shows up in the State Department is going to have to toe that line, which is why I don't think Tulsi will show up there. But if she did, she would be swimming in unfriendly waters. She'd probably have Brian Hook as her deputy and be surrounded by dozens of people in the State Department who are plugging the same line. This is the problem. They say, well, nominate so-and-so, he can go in there and make a difference. It's not easy. It doesn't work that way. If you show up with the kinds of views that Tulsi Gabbard has, you're going to be the Lone Ranger in the biggest rainstorm you've ever seen. And what we're headed towards right now is really the storm of the century. Now, you can quibble about qualifications. Who's qualified, who isn't? For instance, somebody called me, a journalist, and said, what do you think about Pompeo? I said, well, listen, I don't share his views. He and I have virtually nothing in common in terms of our views of the world, but Pompeo is qualified to be Secretary of Defense. There's no question about that. Would I support it? No, and I would argue against it. I'm glad he's not on his way into that job. Then you have to turn your attention to the others that are being appointed various positions, like Waltz and now Hegseth, and you have to ask, where's the evidence for the kinds of things that you would look for in those positions? And I don't see much evidence for them. I mean, I don't want to be that harsh. A friend of mine who's a retired 4-star, and yes, I do have some 4-star friends that are retired, sent me a note, and he said, this is like appointing a tattoo artist to run healthcare for the country. Well, I don't think it's that bad, but people ought to be more concerned about what does this man really know? What does he bring to it? Now, if you're on the Hill, if you're in the Senate, and Rick Scott has made this very clear that whomever Trump, wants in those jobs, he's going to deliver. And I think you've got to keep in mind that once again, the basic question is, where do you stand on war with Iran? What are you prepared to do? That's very important. That's the list. He's very strongly in support of it. He was the guy that just a few weeks ago was arguing we need to give more strike weapons to Ukraine so that they can do more harm to the Russians. I mean, he's done an about face on that, much like Hegseth has, because Trump has, and has moved in a different direction. But these are people that are all ambitious, and that's a good thing. But they're also well aware of which way the wind is blowing. Remember, the problem on the Hill is preeminently concerned about keeping the money flowing. That's the other issue. Are you going to keep the money flowing? Behind closed doors, you're not going to change anything, are you? Don't slow it down. We got to keep it going. And that's what everybody has done now for decades. Oh, we'll keep it going. Don't worry about it, Senator. We'll keep it going. My shipyards have to operate. They have to produce. I got it. I understand that. That's where we are. Okay. And I think these people are all signed on for that. Radcliffe as well. But none of these people are people that you would compare with, say, someone like Paul Nitze, who was Secretary of the Navy, who was a very thoughtful man. And he struggled, in the Navy with ship design like everybody else because he got tired of seeing the same ships turned out from shipyards that were clearly obsolete when there should have been new ships with, based on new designs.
Yeah.
He was moderately successful, not much, but at least he was a thoughtful man. He understood the strategic calculus. He was part of a generation of people, Republicans and Democrats, who all understood what the word war means. These people don't. The war you want to avoid is one where the enemy shoots his AKs and you shoot your M16s. That's called symmetric warfare. We don't want it. We don't want to be involved with it. And somebody with an AK in a distant, remote place of no value to us, no education, and 16 brothers and sisters is just a drop in the bucket and can be killed and replaced instantly. But the people we commit are educated, trained, and they come from families that love them and know them. And they're only family, 2 or 3, perhaps in that family at most. The Israelis are in the same boat. Is that where we want to waste our human capital on these kinds of stupid things? And Tulsi Gabbard has said, no, we don't. She stands for that. I say, no, we don't. That's absolutely clear. All of a sudden, we're back to the same old thing. Well, Ukraine hasn't gone so well. Forget Ukraine. It's going to go away. It's like Vietnam. It went away. Now, what are we going to do? Oh, well, we got a new war to fight. That's in the Middle East. We got to join Israel and wipe out Iran. Nobody asks the question is, what does wipe out Iran mean? And if it means Iran's total destruction, how does that help us? And who does that bring into the equation for discussion? Nobody cares. And I was encouraged to write this paper. It's long, which is always bad because no one in the United States likes to read anything that's more than a few hundred words. This is long. It's 5,700 words. And it looks, what do we need? We need a new strategy. What's that strategy look like? Then what are we going to do about the armed forces? How do we design them? What's driving change? And finally, what are we going to do about the overhead? What's the overhead? And it goes through it pretty systematically. And it's posted by on a website, an anti-war website that supported RFK Jr. It's going to be posted sometime today by Dan McAdams on Ron Paul's website at the Ron Paul Institute. I encourage people to look at it because it was written to be a blueprint that could be a start point for fundamental change, for diverging from the failed policies of the last 3+ decades and move us in a new, more productive direction. It'll be castigated and hated by the neocons and their supporters who want us to go to war with Iran. And it doesn't say don't go to war with Iran or go to war with anybody. On the contrary, it says we need a new strategy. This is the framework, and we need new forces to implement it because the forces we have really are based on something that emerged from the Second World War that's almost 100 years ago. So I encourage people to look at that. I think the easiest access is probably to the Ron Paul Institute's website. People ought to look at it. You don't have to agree with all of it, but consider it as an alternative to where we're headed. And I think we're headed in a very dangerous direction. We haven't even talked, you and I, about the financial system.
Right.
You know, our banking system, according to all of the experts, whether it's James Ricards or Peter Druckenmiller or Gundlach or Nassim Taleb, is 8 times worse today in terms of fragility than it was in 2008. Hello, are we crazy? This isn't going to survive this kind of war, particularly if we go back to where you started. And suddenly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which have historically aligned with us, have marched out of our camp and said, no, we don't support this, and decide to pull all of their wealth out. Well, Dan, consider this. The president of the United States is unique in the world because he is simultaneously both the head of state, which is normally where you see a king or an emperor, and at the same time, he's the political leader of the country and especially his party. So he's 2 things at once. Now, why is that important? Because a lot of people invested very heavily in him for the purpose of getting him elected so that he would back the war against Iran. That needs to be understood. Now, it's very, very difficult under the circumstances for him to ignore that, even though it's obviously in the interest of the American people, in my judgment, to stay away from that option. But he has to take their views into consideration. Anybody who thinks that money in politics really doesn't buy you anything is wrong. Money buys a lot. And cold, hard cash in great quantities has a reason or a reasoning of its own. And you can't survive in politics without it, or at least that's the view. And that's where we are. And it's not just President Trump, it's the entire government. It's a good question. What is his real vision? You also, in addition to listening to what people say, you've also got to look at what they do. When you look at the cabinet, that's what he's doing. And if you don't think that matches things that he said in the past, well, then which side do you come down on? You have to come down on the side of what does he do? So I think it's pretty clear. Now, every president, let there be no mistake about this, has the right to select whomever the hell he wants. Now, the Senate doesn't necessarily have to comply. And clearly, during his last administration, he had no support from anybody on the Hill. Mitch McConnell ran a very powerful campaign of prevarication and outright disobedience and opposition. And he had the support of Schumer and his friends in the Democratic Party. This time it's a little different. The Republicans are going to control the Senate. But at the same time, remember that the Senate doesn't have to do that. They could resist. They could say thanks, but no thanks. But historically, Senate has turned out to be a rubber stamp Roman Senate. And the president is effectively being like the emperor. Unless, of course, it represents a disruption in the money flow. If you're going to stop the money, that's bad news. And so anybody who talks about cutting anything in terms of spending, I'm afraid things are going to have to progress to the point where there is no longer any choice but to cut. And we're not as far from that as many people think. And again, I cite the people, Ricards and the others. And remember, debt has always brought down empires. And we are an empire at this point, like it or not.